Iran just fired ballistic missiles at the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters. The ceasefire is finished. Iran just fired ballistic missiles at the United States Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, and at the same moment, drones and ballistic missiles hit Ali al-Salem Air Base in Kuwait. 8 targets, 2 countries, 1 coordinated strike package executed in a single 60-minute window. This happened less than 12 days after both countries signed a ceasefire agreement, less than 12 days after the world was told the shooting was stopping. And here's the question you need to be sitting with right now. If Iran is willing to fire ballistic missiles at American military headquarters during an active ceasefire, what exactly is the ceasefire for? And what happens when the United States decides it cannot be reasonable anymore? Let me build the full picture from the beginning. Not from Sunday morning, from Wednesday. Because you cannot understand how we arrived at ballistic missiles over Bahrain without understanding the 72-hour sequence that produced them. Every single step in that sequence was a decision. Every single decision reveals something about the strategic logic of the parties making it. And understanding that logic is the only way to understand where this is going in the next 72 hours. June 25th. The IRGC launches 4 drones at the MV Ever Lovely, a Singapore-flagged container ship transiting the southern Omani corridor. 3 are shot down, 1 hits the bridge. This is not a missed warning shot. This is a deliberate strike on a commercial vessel during an active ceasefire period. The International Maritime Organization immediately pauses its evacuation plan for 11,000 sailors currently trapped in the Gulf. President Trump publicly describes the attack as a foolish breach of the ceasefire. June 26th. CENTCOM executes precision strikes against Iranian missile and drone storage facilities and coastal radar sites at Keshem Island, Sirik, Jask, and Bandar Abbas. 6 aircraft, 4 targets. The footage is released publicly within hours. The message is calibrated and proportional. The intent is to degrade Iran's ability to conduct drone attacks on commercial shipping while preserving enough diplomatic space for the ceasefire framework to survive. June 27th. At 4:30 in the morning, a one-way attack drone strikes the oil tanker Kokuka, a Panamanian-flagged vessel carrying crude oil for Qatar's state energy company. For those not immediately tracking the significance of that target, Qatar is one of the primary mediators between the United States and Iran. Qatar helped broker the Memorandum of Understanding. The IRGC just struck a vessel carrying fuel for the country that has been negotiating on Iran's behalf. CENTCOM issues a statement saying Iran was given a chance to honor the ceasefire after the June 26 strikes, and in the official language, elected not to. A second round of American strikes follows within 24 hours. Surveillance infrastructure, communication systems, air defense sites, drone storage facilities, mine-laying capabilities, a second broader round of coastal architecture gone. Then comes Friday evening into Saturday. Bahrain's foreign ministry reports that a number of Iranian drones targeted Bahraini territory. U.S. officials confirmed detection of a small number of drones. None reached their intended target. American and Bahraini air defenses intercept them. And then, between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. on Sunday morning, the escalation crosses a threshold that the entire ceasefire framework was specifically designed to prevent. Ballistic missiles and drones simultaneously targeting Bahrain and Kuwait. 8 targets described by IRGC spokesman Ibrahim al-Fakhar as U.S. military infrastructure. The Ali al-Salem Air Base in Kuwait. The U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters near Port Salman in Bahrain. This is the largest coordinated IRGC strike against Gulf partner nations since the opening weeks of this conflict, and it represents a fundamental shift in the category of weapon being used and the category of target being selected. Before this moment, the IRGC's attacks during the ceasefire period were concentrated on commercial shipping, drones against tankers, harassment of vessels in the Strait. The stated logic, from Tehran's perspective, was enforcement of Article 5 of the MOU, the clause requiring Iranian authority over Strait of Hormuz passage. The targets were economic. The message was about leverage. Sunday morning is different in a way that matters enormously. Sunday morning, the IRGC moved from targeting commercial shipping to targeting military headquarters. From drones to ballistic missiles, from economic pressure to direct military confrontation with the institutional infrastructure, managing the American presence in the Gulf. The Fifth Fleet headquarters is not a symbolic target. It is the operational brain of U.S. naval power across an area of operations spanning the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, the Red Sea, parts of the Indian Ocean, and 3 bodies of water that collectively carry approximately 40% of global seaborne trade. If the Fifth Fleet headquarters is degraded, disrupted, or destroyed, the command and control architecture that coordinates every American military response in the region is directly compromised. That is not a proportional action under any interpretation of the ceasefire framework. That is a strategic escalation targeting the nerve center of American military command. And yet the physical damage produced was limited. In Kuwait, air defenses intercepted the 2 ballistic missiles. No casualties, no major damage. The intercept worked. In Bahrain, the picture is less clean. A residential building in Bahrain's Muharraq Governorate took significant structural damage overnight. Sirens sounded across the kingdom. The Interior Ministry directed residents to remain calm and move to the nearest safe location. Bahraini civil defense and rescue teams worked through the night in smoke and debris. No American casualties have been confirmed as of this analysis, and no major U.S. facility sustained confirmed damage. But here is the part that needs to land before the tactical analysis continues. A residential building in Muharraq was heavily damaged, not a military installation, not a defense facility, a place where people live. That is the human reality underneath all of the strategic geometry, and it matters more than any platform specification or capability assessment. When the analysis talks about intercept rates and damage profiles and degraded capabilities, the human cost of what is happening on the ground in Bahrain, and inside Iran, and on the vessels in the Gulf, and in the families of the 11,000 sailors still trapped in the region, is what is actually at stake. That needs to be stated plainly before anything else. Now let us talk about what the Sunday strike package actually reveals. The IRGC launched from its naval and aerospace forces simultaneously ballistic missiles at Kuwait's Ali al-Salem airbase, drones at the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, 2 different weapon systems, 2 different countries, same 60-minute window. That is not an improvised response. That is a planned, coordinated, multi-domain operation that required pre-positioned assets, synchronized launch authority, and an operational planning process that was underway well before the trigger was pulled. This was not reactive, this was prepared. Ibrahim al-Fikar, spokesman for Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya central headquarters, made a public statement after the strikes that is worth reading carefully. Any new U.S. aggression, he said, regardless of pretext or scale, would be met with a crushing response, and violating the ceasefire would halt all diplomatic tracks. Iran's foreign minister simultaneously stated that Saturday's American strikes amounted to a clear violation of the June 18 ceasefire memorandum and demonstrated that Washington places no real value on its own commitments. And then came the statement from the White House that reframed the entire strategic environment with a single sentence. President Trump posted on Truth Social confirming that American aircraft had struck Iranian missile, drone, and radar sites in response to continued ceasefire violations. He warned that the United States might reach a point where it could no longer be reasonable. And he added, and this is the sentence that every government in the region, every intelligence service, every defense ministry from Beijing to Brussels, is now analyzing word by word, that the Islamic Republic of Iran will no longer exist if Washington is forced to militarily complete what it started. That is not diplomatic language. That is not signaling. That is not a proportional warning calibrated to produce behavioral change at the margins. That is a terminal public declaration by the President of the United States about the existence of a sovereign state. And whatever one thinks about the circumstances that produced it, the strategic weight of that sentence cannot be understated. Every Iranian decision-maker is now calculating under a publicly stated American position that the ultimate endpoint of military escalation is regime elimination, and the question of how the IRGC's hardline leadership responds to a terminal threat versus how they respond to a proportional cost-benefit calculation is a fundamentally different analytical problem. But here is the part nobody is talking about, and it is the most important strategic detail in the entire Sunday picture. The Kokuka tanker, the vessel that Iran struck on June 27th, the one carrying crude oil for Qatar's state energy company. Qatar, let me be explicit about this, is one of the primary mediators between Iran and the United States in the ceasefire negotiations. Qatar's foreign ministry facilitated back-channel communications. Qatar's diplomatic position has been consistently oriented toward producing a negotiated outcome. Qatar has significant economic and political incentive to see this conflict de-escalate because Qatar's energy exports, including the largest liquefied natural gas operation on the planet, depend on stable passage through the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC just struck a vessel carrying fuel for the country that has been negotiating on Iran's behalf. That is not an accident of targeting. That is a message. And the message is this. The IRGC does not feel bound by the arrangements that Qatar helped broker. Qatar's role as mediator does not protect Qatar's economic interests from IRGC operations. If you are going to act as a go-between for the Americans, your tankers are not exempt from our enforcement posture. That message has consequences that extend far beyond the Kokuka. It signals to every potential mediator in the region, Oman, Turkey, any Gulf state considering whether to facilitate further negotiations, that facilitating diplomacy on America's behalf carries a direct economic cost that the IRGC is willing to impose. The effect on the diplomatic architecture is corrosive. Now let me address the defense picture directly, because the performance of Gulf air defense systems on Sunday morning carries strategic significance in both directions. Kuwait's successful interception of 2 ballistic missiles with no casualties and no major damage is not a minor footnote. It is an operational demonstration of the layered regional air defense architecture that the United States has been building with Gulf partner nations over the past decade. The Patriot missile defense batteries deployed across Kuwait and Bahrain, backed by the Aegis combat systems on U.S. Navy destroyers positioned in the Gulf, and by the integrated sensor network feeding targeting data across the entire system in real time, performed at the level they were designed to perform. The intercept worked. Under the most operationally stressful conditions, a coordinated, simultaneous, multi-domain attack, the system engaged and neutralized the ballistic missile threat before it reached its target. That is genuinely significant. It is not a surprise to the people who built and operate that system. But it matters to state it clearly because the Gulf defense architecture often exists in public discourse as an abstraction, a set of acronyms and platform names, rather than as a real operational system that, on Sunday morning, intercepted ballistic missiles over Kuwait and prevented what could have been a catastrophic event. But the Bahrain side of the picture tells the other half of the story. A residential building took structural damage. The response in Muharraq was not a clean intercept with no damage. The layered defense system, even at its most capable, is not perfect. And the IRGC's Sunday strike package was specifically designed to test and potentially overwhelm it, hitting 2 countries simultaneously with 2 weapon types in the same 60-minute window to divide and saturate defensive responses. And here is what that performance gap actually tells us about the current state of Iran's military capability. Iran's blue water navy is at the bottom of the sea. Its ballistic missile bunker infrastructure was severely degraded during earlier American strike operations. Its coastal radar network has been progressively stripped by 4 rounds of U.S. strikes over the past 3 days. The IRGC launched 8 targets worth of missiles and drones at Bahrain and Kuwait in its most ambitious coordinated strike of this conflict and produced 1 damaged residential building and 0 American casualties. The gap between what the IRGC said it was going to do, a crushing response, and what the Sunday strike package actually produced in terms of strategic damage is the clearest available measure of how significantly the earlier phases of this conflict have degraded Iran's real military capability, as opposed to its messaging capability, which remains fully operational. Iran can threaten, Iran can launch, Iran can reach Gulf partner territory, but its ability to produce damage commensurate with its ambitions has been substantially reduced by the accumulated effects of earlier strike operations. And that gap between ambition and capability is precisely what is driving the escalating intensity of the IRGC's rhetoric. Because rhetoric is the one domain where its losses from previous strike packages have not yet registered. This creates a specific danger. When a military organization's capability has been degraded, but its strategic goals have not changed, and its rhetoric has not moderated, it faces increasing pressure to demonstrate capability through increasingly ambitious attempts. The Sunday strike package, ballistic missiles at American military headquarters, was an attempt to demonstrate that the IRGC remains capable of meaningful offensive operations despite 4 rounds of American strikes degrading its infrastructure. The fact that it produced limited physical damage does not reduce the strategic intent behind the attempt. It may in fact increase the pressure on IRGC leadership to attempt something larger next time. That is the escalation dynamic that the proportional response model was designed to manage and is struggling to contain. Now let's build the Lebanon dimension into this analysis, because the ceasefire framework is not fracturing on one track. It is fracturing simultaneously on 2 tracks, and most coverage is treating them as separate stories when they are actually the same story operating in 2 theaters. On June 26th, a trilateral framework agreement among the United States, Israel, and Lebanon was signed in Washington. Secretary of State Rubio described it as a first step toward peace. Hezbollah's leader, Naim Qassem, rejected it outright within hours, calling it a humiliation, a disgrace, and a surrender of Lebanese sovereignty. Within a day of the signing, Lebanese state media reported a fresh Israeli drone strike in the Nabatea area of southern Lebanon. Iran's foreign ministry then added a condition that has not been present in its public statements before. Any lasting settlement with Washington must include a full Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz simultaneously stated publicly that Israeli forces intend to maintain what he described as a security zone in southern Lebanon, regardless of any agreement. Full Iranian demand, complete Israeli withdrawal. Israeli public commitment, permanent security zone, regardless of any agreement. Those 2 positions are not close to reconcilable. They are not the kind of positions where creative diplomatic language finds a middle ground. They are structurally incompatible in a way that means the Lebanon track cannot deliver what Iran says it requires. And Israel has publicly foreclosed the outcome Iran says it will accept. But here is why the Lebanon dimension is not a separate story. It is the mechanism. The IRGC's position is that Israel's continued presence in southern Lebanon constitutes an American breach of the broader ceasefire commitments made in the June 18 MOU. And that breach, the American failure to ensure Israeli compliance with the Lebanon terms, gives the IRGC doctrinal justification to treat the entire memorandum as void, not just the Lebanon article, the whole framework. This is the trap mechanic that the IRGC has been running since the ink dried on the MOU, and it is worth stating it as explicitly as possible because it is the loop that explains every single event from June 18th to Sunday morning. Iran's pragmatic faction signs the ceasefire. The IRGC's hardline identifies a third-party action, Israel conducting a drone strike in Lebanon, the United States striking coastal radar sites, whatever is available in the news cycle, and frames that action as an American breach that voids the agreement. This framing allows the IRGC to escalate while maintaining the legal and diplomatic posture of responding to a violation rather than initiating one. The United States responds to the IRGC's escalation. The IRGC frames the American response as further violation. The loop repeats. Every iteration of that loop serves the IRGC's core strategic interest, and that interest is not the preservation of the ceasefire. It is the preservation of Strait of Hormuz control. Every iteration of the loop keeps the question of who governs maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz unresolved. And as long as that question remains unresolved, Iran retains its leverage. The leverage is estimated by some analysts at roughly $90 billion in annual strategic value, the premium that effective control over the world's most critical oil choke point represents in terms of deterrence, economic influence, and negotiating power. That is the number the IRGC is protecting. And it is a number large enough that even significant degradation of infrastructure, even the loss of coastal radar networks and drone storage facilities, does not by itself change the calculation. Because the strategic value of Strait control exceeds the replacement cost of the assets being destroyed. Breaking that loop requires something the proportional infrastructure strike model cannot provide, a cost that the IRGC's decision-making leadership personally bears at a level that exceeds the value of the position they are protecting. The proportional response model has been targeting infrastructure. Infrastructure can be rebuilt, dispersed, or replaced. The people running the IRGC's strategic calculus are not infrastructure. They are individuals with personal risk assessments. And the personal risk calculation of IRGC leadership has not yet been directly confronted by the American response to Sunday's strikes. That is the analytical gap that President Trump's Truth Social statement, his declaration that Iran will no longer exist if Washington is forced to complete what it started, may be attempting to address. Not through a military action, at least not yet, but through a credible threat of a qualitatively different category of response. Whether that threat is credible to the IRGC's hardline leadership is the central question of the next 72 hours. Now let us talk about the economic dimension, because this is the layer of reality that most geopolitical coverage buries under the strategic analysis, and that directly affects every person watching this, regardless of whether they have any interest in Middle Eastern affairs. Brent crude oil was trading at approximately $72.48 per barrel on February 27, 2026, the day before the conflict escalated into direct military exchange. By March 27, Brent had reached $112.50 per barrel. That is a surge of more than 55% in 30 days. The cause was not abstract. It was the closure of Strait of Hormuz passage, which cut off roughly 1/5 of global seaborne oil supply and a significant share of global liquefied natural gas shipments simultaneously. The International Energy Agency described it as the greatest energy security challenge in the agency's 50-year history. Oil prices have come down from that peak. The ceasefire produced cautious optimism in energy markets. By late May, Brent had fallen roughly 20% from its 2026 highs. But Sunday morning strikes on U.S. military headquarters in Bahrain and Kuwait happened before Asian markets opened for the week. The market reaction when trading resumes will be the first real-time economic verdict on what Sunday night means for the trajectory of this conflict. The oil market numbers need to be translated into human terms rather than per-barrel abstractions. The difference between $72 oil and $112 oil translates to approximately 50 to 70 cents per gallon of additional cost at an American gas station, sustained across months. Multiplied across every household, every commercial vehicle, every truck, every supply chain in the United States, that price differential represents an enormous economic transfer from American consumers to the volatility created by this conflict. The 4th of July, America's 250th birthday celebration, is days away. If oil markets spike sharply on Monday morning, American families filling their tanks ahead of the holiday weekend will be paying the direct economic cost of what happened in the Gulf last night. But the oil price impact on American consumers, significant as it is not the most severe human cost in this story. The most severe human cost is inside Iran. Iranian government statistics report annual inflation at approximately 89% as of the period covered by this analysis. 89%. That means the price of bread, of fuel, of medicine, of everything an ordinary Iranian family purchases to sustain daily life has nearly doubled in 1 year. The estimated economic damage to Iran's domestic economy from this conflict is assessed by Iranian government economists at potentially $1 trillion. $1 trillion of economic destruction inside a country of 90 million people, the overwhelming majority of whom had no role in any of the decisions that produced this confrontation. The IRGC generals calculating the strategic value of Strait of Hormuz control are not standing in breadlines. The commanders authorizing Sunday morning's ballistic missile strikes are not choosing between medication and food for their children. The 90 million ordinary Iranian people living through 89% annual inflation are doing exactly that. That distinction between the people making the decisions that drive this conflict and the people bearing its human cost is the most important moral and strategic fact in this entire situation. It is also the distinction that receives the least attention and coverage focused on strike packages, intercept rates, and ballistic missile trajectories. It needs to be stated plainly, clearly, and repeatedly, because the human cost of this confrontation is real. It is being borne primarily by people who had no say in the choices that created it, and no strategic analysis is complete without that acknowledgement. Now let us close with the honest strategic assessment. The Memorandum of Understanding is 11 days old. In those 11 days, Iran has struck commercial shipping, launched a one-way drone the morning after the first American retaliatory strike, targeted Bahraini territory with drones, and on Sunday morning fired ballistic missiles at American military headquarters in 2 Gulf partner nations. The United States has executed 4 rounds of retaliatory strikes in 3 days. Iran's foreign ministry has formally declared that American strikes constitute MOU violations, and has warned that the diplomatic track is at risk of collapse. Both sides are simultaneously striking each other and claiming the other violated the agreement first. This is not a ceasefire. This is an active conflict running at reduced intensity with a diplomatic framework attached to it that neither side is currently honoring in practice, and both sides are publicly citing as justification for their actions. The options available to Washington right now are genuinely difficult in a way that deserves honest assessment rather than optimistic resolution. The first option is restraint. The administration could absorb the Bahrain and Kuwait strikes, refrain from further immediate retaliation, and attempt to restart the diplomatic track on the grounds that the escalation has reached a level that threatens the framework entirely. The risk is significant and strategic. If the IRGC reads American restraint after ballistic missiles hit American military headquarters as confirmation that this category of attack carries no military consequence, it establishes a new floor for acceptable escalation. Every future IRGC strike decision is made against that precedent. The second option is a significantly elevated military response, targeting not just coastal infrastructure but IRGC command nodes, leadership infrastructure, or capabilities not yet addressed in previous strike rounds. The risk here is that this formally ends the ceasefire framework and restarts major combat operations at a scale that both governments have publicly stated they want to avoid, with consequences for oil markets, Gulf state stability, the nuclear track, and American resource commitment that the current $87 billion supplemental request only partially addresses. The third option, which some voices in Washington have been advancing, is a fundamental reorientation of the American strategic posture in the Strait of Hormuz toward permanent operational control of the waterway, removing the governance dispute entirely by establishing U.S. enforcement authority over passage as a durable fact rather than a contested position. The risk is that this requires a sustained force posture commitment that is enormously expensive, that sets a global precedent for American military management of international waterways, and that commits American military resources to the Gulf indefinitely in a way that has implications for every other theater of American strategic concern. There is no clean option. There is no path from here to a resolution that is stable, durable, and affordable. The situation has moved past the point where any single decision by any single party produces the outcome that all parties publicly claim to want. And that brings us to the question that every person watching this needs to be sitting with right now, the question that is more consequential than any specific target list or diplomatic statement. If the IRGC launched ballistic missiles at American military headquarters in 2 countries during an active ceasefire, and the consequence was a proportional strike on coastal radar infrastructure and drone storage facilities, what does the IRGC learn from that exchange? They learn that ballistic missiles aimed at the nerve center of American Naval Command in the Middle East produce the same category of American response as drone attacks on commercial shipping. They learn that the escalation cost of targeting American military headquarters rather than Singaporean container ships is not materially different in the damage it brings back to their own infrastructure. They learned that the American proportional response model has a ceiling and that the ceiling is coastal infrastructure. That calculation tells you exactly what the IRGC's next decision is likely to be, and it is not de-escalation. What changes that calculation is not a question about whether the ceasefire can be saved. The ceasefire, in any meaningful operational sense, no longer exists. The question is whether the cost-benefit assessment in the minds of the IRGC's leadership can be changed. And changing that assessment requires either a direct personal cost imposed on the decision-makers themselves, a credible threat of consequences at a scale that exceeds the value of the Strait control position they are protecting, or an alternative that gives the IRGC's hardline faction a path to its core strategic goal: recognized authority over Hormuz passage, without requiring continued military escalation. None of those options are easy, none of them are without risk, and all of them require decisions that are significantly more difficult than another round of strikes on coastal radar sites. The next 72 hours will tell us which path Washington has chosen. The U.S. response to Sunday's ballistic missile strikes has not yet been publicly announced as of this analysis. When it comes, and it is coming, the scale, the target set, and the language accompanying it will answer the question of whether the American strategy has fundamentally changed or whether the proportional model is being continued with higher intensity. Watch the oil markets when they open on Monday. Watch for the IRGC's formal response to whatever American action follows. Watch for Oman, Qatar, or any third-party mediator moving diplomatically. Watch for any communication from Beijing, which has enormous economic incentive to prevent this conflict from disrupting the Strait of Hormuz passage that carries Chinese energy imports. And watch for whether Iran's political leadership and its military leadership begin producing visibly different messages, because the gap between those two voices, if it widens, is the first indication that the internal Iranian political balance around this conflict is under pressure. 11 days ago, both countries signed a piece of paper and the world exhaled. Sunday morning, ballistic missiles flew over the Gulf and people in Bahrain ran for shelter. The distance between those two moments is the distance between a ceasefire on paper and reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground right now is a conflict with no agreed endpoint, no shared understanding of what resolution looks like, and no mechanism for enforcing the agreement that was supposed to produce one. What do you think changes the IRGC's calculus? Drop your assessment in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, and tell me whether you think Sunday night was the peak of this escalation or the beginning of something larger. This community has consistently produced sharper analysis than the professional coverage, and this is the question that matters most right now. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The U.S. response to Sunday's strikes is coming. When it does, this channel will have the full breakdown.